This week, we're moving on to the second unit of the course, poetry. Some of you might have a great deal of experience reading poetry. For others, this might be entirely new. If that's the case, you'll need to adopt different reading strategies than the ones that you use when reading prose. I've posted a quick guide in your modules that will help with this. Oftentimes when we think of poetry, we think of Shakespeare's sonnets or an inspirational poem by someone like Robert Frost. This, though, is just one type of poetry called lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is probably what you think of when you imagine a poem, a shorter text that expresses the thoughts or emotions of the speaker and usually has a set form or rhythm. It dates back to the earliest examples of writing and is featured as part of the literary development in most cultures. It can be distinguished from dramatic and narrative poetry. Narrative poetry is a poem that tells a story and is one of the earliest kinds of literature. Classic texts like Beowulf and the Odyssey are narrative poems. Dramatic poetry presents a scene in spoken form, sometimes as a monologue with one speaker and sometimes as a dialogue. In both narrative and dramatic poetry, you'll see clear characters and a plot, much like you would find in fiction. Reading lyric poetry, though, is a bit different from reading prose text or even narrative poetry. The meaning is often more difficult to determine because the language is much more minimal, and writers rely significantly on imagery, symbolism, and even the sound and rhythm of the poem to bring across the meaning. They also often adopt personas, so even when it may seem like the poems are expressing the emotions of the author, there's a different, unnamed speaker or alternative viewpoint being explored. In order to understand how the poetry is working, it's important to be familiar with some specific techniques that the authors might be using. One significant way that poets communicate is through the use of literary devices such as metonymy, alliteration, and assonance. Metonymy is the use of the name of one thing for something closely related. For example, saying the head to represent reason or the heart to represent emotion. This type of metaphor allows the authors to use a visual, concrete object to stand in for a much more abstract element. Alliteration is a literary device that uses the repetition of consonants, usually at the beginning of the word, to create a stylistic effect in writing. For example, in Poe's Raven, he says, "The silken, satin, certain rustling of each purple curtain." This repeated S sounds creates an impression of the rustling curtains within the language itself. Similarly, assonance is a literary device that uses the repetition of vowels, usually at the beginning of the word, to create a stylistic effect in writing. Again from Poe. "Thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beating of my heart I stood repeating, 'tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, this it is and nothing more." Both of these techniques allow the writer to use not just the meaning of language, but its actual sound to communicate the feeling that they are trying to express through the poem. Authors might also use the form of the poem to further their message or theme. When discussing the form of the poem, there's some basic terms that are helpful to know, and as always, these terms are in your course glossary if you need to review them later. First, syntax is the way in which words are ordered to create clauses, phrases, and sentences. A stanza is the group of lines in a poem set off from the others, basically a poetic paragraph. The repetition of the final stressed vowel sound of poetry is called rhyme. Rhythm is the beat of a poem created by the stressed and unstressed syllables. Foot is the smallest repeated unit of the rhythmic pattern in a poem. Finally, meter is the pattern formed when the lines of a poem follow a recurrent rhythm. So, for example, when you read Shakespeare, he used iambic pentameter. An iamb is a foot that has the specific pattern of an unaccented and short syllable, followed by a long and accented syllable, ba-bum, kind of like a heartbeat. Penta means 5, so pentameter is 5-part meter. Put it all together and you get 5 ba-bums. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf hath all too short a date. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum." Finally, authors might play with the connotation and denotation of words to bring their meaning across. Denotation is the unambiguous dictionary definition of a word. Connotation is the emotional weight or social baggage a word brings that colors the way we use or understand it. For example, even though they have the same denotation, dictionary meaning, the connotation of a cottage in the forest is different than a cabin in the woods. Pocket dial is very different than booty call, and forgive me, Father, for I have sinned has a very different connotation than sorry, Daddy, I've been naughty. All of these elements give poetry great potential for expression, but they can also make them difficult for a reader to sort through. So if you find it challenging, don't give up. This week's readings will cover some major elements of poetry: speaker, setting, tone and theme, language, and imagery. Rather than focusing on specific authors, therefore, you'll be introduced to a lot of poems from various writers and time periods. Even though the poems aren't labeled according to literary periods, they still belong to them. See if you can't tell the modernists from the romantics. As always, remember your discussion board and reading journal. Your first writing project is due on Sunday as well. It's worth 20% of your final grade, so give it the time and attention that it needs. Let me know if you need help, and happy reading.